We are going back to the year of 1999. Picture this. The New York Knicks, one of the most iconic brands in sports. A team that defied the odds, embraced the role of Cinderella, is etching their names in basketball immortality amidst age, lockouts, injuries, and more. But as the saying goes, heroes emerge in the face of adversity.
From unexpected stars stepping into the stoplight to unforgettable victories that echoed through Madison Square Garden, this is a tale of determination, passion, and the indomitable spirit of a team unwilling to back down.
So buckle up as we travel back to a time when underdogs became giants, and the 1999 Knicks etched their names in the annals of NBA folklore. This is a podcast that goes beyond the box score, captivating the essence of a team that refused to be counted out, even when the odds seemed insurmountable.
So get ready for a nostalgic ride through the highs and lows of a Cinderella story that unfolded on the hardwood. This is Josh and Calvin with Once Upon a Dribble.
And we're back at it again.
Back right at it.
Welcome in, however you're listening and wherever you're listening. We appreciate you joining us here on Once Upon a Dribble. And Josh, today we're going back to an era of NBA basketball that is so near and dear to my heart. I was born in the 90s and got my first taste of actually comprehending NBA basketball right there at the late 90s, early 2000s. It was just a great time for me. What about you?
Yeah, I know we've mentioned it before, and it really is a nostalgic time. This, like you said, this kind of late 90s leaking into the early 2000s, mid 2000s, just because that's when we fell in love with the sport. So, it's, when we're younger, we kind of just get the feeling of the overall magic of the sport and the captivating presence of these players. But it's a treat now that we're older to actually go back and to do a little more research and to kind of dive into what went into these iconic moments, these iconic teams, these iconic players. So, whenever we go back to this specific era in the NBA time machine, I know it's an extra special treat for us.
It is. And, they say there's always someone who had to walk before someone else could run. This past year, the Miami Heat, an 8 seed in the play-in. Jimmy Butler takes that team all the way to the NBA Finals.
Mm-hmm.
And they ultimately do not prevail, as we all know by now. But an 8 seed making a playoff run of that magnitude, you would think that is a once in a NBA history type of event, but it was not the first time. We're going to actually take the story, like we said, back to the late 90s in a very interesting transitional era for the NBA. This is post-MJ, pre-LeBron NBA territory. And Josh, before we get there, we're just going to dive right into it. Before we get there, we have to understand where the Knicks were as a team going into this 98-99 NBA season, and for that matter, where the NBA was, as it was actually a very tumultuous year for the association, a season that very nearly did not happen.
Mm-hmm.
But before we get to that, let's wind the clock back, because the story of the 1990s Knicks, it always begins and ends with Patrick Ewing. The Hoya Destroyer.
Great nickname, I gotta say that quick.
Absolute elite nickname. The Hoya Destroyer was considered a generational talent coming into the NBA, particularly in an era where the big man was the backbone, the heart, and the soul of any NBA team. Now, Josh, we could spend an entire episode on the events that led up to the 1985 NBA draft.
Oh,
well,
man,
that's conspiracies that led up, right?
I was going to say that it's the controversial 85 draft. There's a lot. You can really get your tinfoil hat on for that draft.
And maybe we'll dive into that in a future episode. But for now, suffice to say, the Knicks had won the rights to draft the 7-footer from Kingston, Jamaica. He's fresh out of his senior season at Georgetown and fresh off winning a National Player of the Year to display beside the national championship his Warriors had earned the year prior. So, despite a fantastic Rookie of the Year campaign, it wasn't instant success for the Knicks. They were in a dark time in this era in Knicks history, and they would not see any noteworthy team success with their new cornerstone until the 88-89 season. That's where we saw the Knicks with their first winning season in 8 years, and that season came to an end in the second round of the playoffs at the hands of Michael Jordan, who, by the way, averaged 36 and 10 and 8 over that 6-game series.
Wow.
Basically a 36-point triple-double. Now, for Ewing and Big Apple basketball fans, this would become an all-too familiar motif, as the Knicks would fall to Chicago in the playoffs, get this, 4 of the next 5 years.
Wow.
That's all culminating in the 1993 Eastern Conference Finals, where they were defeated by MJ, who was on his way to a three-peat.
Wow. I mean, that's crazy, because I know nowadays you joke about LeBronto, LeBron James's teams knocking out the Raptors all those years in the 2010s, but you can dial the clock back 25, 30 years, and that's Michael Jordan beating down the Knicks year after year.
GOATs doing GOAT things, and other teams sometimes just get in the way. But suffice to say, at the end of the 92-93 season, we know the story. MJ would say sayonara to the NBA in pursuit of a professional baseball career. There's another can of potential conspiracy theories, but we're going to skip past that because we all know how the story would end. But in the immediate aftermath of the GOAT's first retirement, he left a wide-open Eastern Conference and frankly, a wide-open NBA. The Knicks, who were coming off a 60-win campaign, were more than eager to fill the power vacuum, and indeed they would do just that, with Ewing putting up 25 and 11 per game. The Knickerbockers would storm through the season, finishing first in the East, and finally getting revenge against Chicago in the playoffs, albeit that was the Pippen-led Chicago team. This would lead the Knicks to the NBA Finals that season. It was the first appearance in the Big Dance in 21 years. Now, standing in between New York and the Larry O'Brien Trophy stood the Houston Rockets and league MVP Hakeem the Dream Olajuwon. Now, we've talked about Olajuwon many times in previous episodes. Easily a top 10 NBA player, in my opinion. I think Josh, you would agree with that.
Yeah.
And Ewing, not that far behind. And although Ewing had only finished 5th in MVP voting that season, a lot of people would say that he had the better sidekick going into this finals matchup. We're talking about John Starks. John was a undrafted acquisition by Golden State out of Oklahoma State all the way back in '88. And he was promptly waived after appearing in just 35 games his rookie season. He had spent significant parts of the next 2 seasons playing in obscure semi-pro leagues before receiving an invite to try out for the Knicks in 1990. So this is a tryout. It's a non-guaranteed player. And the ever-competent Starks attempts to dunk over Patrick Ewing in practice in a tryout. Well, this was a mistake and resulted in Starks taking a vicious fall and injuring his knees. Injuring a knee. So, a CBA clause at the time, Josh, prevented teams from cutting injured players after a certain date. So, the Knicks were basically stuck guaranteeing a roster spot for this plucky semi-pro that nobody knew from the Sooner State. Well, what seemed like a nightmare scenario, however, soon blossomed into a Hollywood-style dream. This is one of my most favorite stories. John Starks spent the next several years not only proving he belonged, but becoming a starter, making the all-defensive team, and with averages of 19 and 6 and one of the best three-point shots in the game at the time, He even lands alongside his teammate Ewing on that season's Star team, leading up to those 93 finals.
That's a cool story.
Now, as inspiring as the story is of John Starks, combined with the presence of a top 50 all-time player like Ewing, that was just enough for the Knicks to stay alive for 7 games. But ultimately, a larger-on's greatness prevailed on both ends of the court, as he averaged 27 points on 50% shooting, while hurting Ewing to just 19 points per contest on 36% shooting. That's abysmal for a big man in this era of basketball. In any era of basketball, it could be argued. As bad as that was even eclipsed by his sidekick, John Starks' Game 7 travesty of 2 of 18 shooting in Game 7. It was so bad that 29 years later, Starks would admit that, quote, "You never get over it. You just kind of put it in a little box in your mind and keep it there, but as a player, you never forget that." And indeed, Starks would never again reach that All-Star level, and over the next 4 years, it appeared the Knicks may never again have such an opportunity, as year in and year out resulted in a second-round playoff exit. The end of the 95 campaign was especially painful, as legendary coach Pat Riley notified the Knicks front office that he would be taking a job as president and coach of the Miami Heat. Now, interestingly, Riley's method of passing this information along, Josh, a fax.
Oh, man.
This is the mid-90s equivalent of getting dumped via text message. Okay?
I was gonna say this is how they did it in yesteryear. Fax. That's hilarious. Imagine being the secretary. You're just the front desk person, and that comes in, and you're like, "Sir, we just got a fax from Coach Riley. He's out of here."
And out of there he was, down to South Beach. And that left the Knicks in need of a head coach. They actually were very close to bringing in Chuck Daly, another legend. He ultimately declines. From there, they hired another legend, Don Nelson. Now, Nelson takes over in 95-96, but he doesn't really achieve anything particularly great. In fact, he doesn't even get to finish the season. Okay, he wanted to install an up-tempo brand of basketball that was frankly just a bad match for the Knicks' aging roster. And then news began to trickle down into the locker room that Nelson was lobbying for the team to trade Patrick Ewing, 33 years old at the time, in a bid to acquire Shaquille O'Neal. So once you try to trade Mr. Nick, your goose is cooked. Nelson would say, "Somehow that got back to Ewing, and after that, I was toast."
I appreciate the self-awareness, at least.
At least he knows what's going on.
Yeah.
And he was let go mid-season, and he had a respectable record. He was 35-25. So the man that's going to replace him is this long-term assistant, just 33 years old, by the name of Jeff Van Gundy. Now, keep in mind, he's 33, Josh. He's just 7 months older than Patrick Ewing when he takes over as the head coach. And, he would lead the Knicks into a playoff where there was once again an unfortunate collision with the experienced Nick Killer himself, MJ, and another second-round exit for the Knicks. And this just keeps going. For the entire 90s, for the next 2 seasons, while their long-term adversaries in Chicago are capping off another three-peat, the Knicks are stuck in no man's land. They're not good enough to contend for a title. They're not bad enough to pick up draft assets. Their star player is only getting older and older. By the end of the 97-98 campaign, which concluded in just a 5-game smackdown courtesy of Reggie Miller's Pacers, the future of the franchise was in question, with their soon-to-be 37 years old, showing significant signs of drop-off. But Josh, as we know at this point, the future of the franchise wasn't just in question. The future of the NBA was very much in question.
Yeah, coming off of this 97-98 season, we got this unprecedented lockout. We've had shortened seasons in recent history with COVID. Of course, in 2011, we had the lockout heading into the 11-12 season, but there was nothing quite like the 1998-99 NBA lockout. The NBA had actually dealt with very brief lockouts just a few years prior, back in 95 and 96. One of those lasting no more than a couple of months. The other one no more than even a few hours before, on both occasions, the players and owners were able to reach a deal.
I did not know that. That must have been an awkward meeting.
Right. I mean, I didn't realize. Yeah, one of them literally just a few hours long, and they were able to resolve their differences. And before 1998, I mean, the NBA was the only major sports league in the United States to have never lost a game because of a work stoppage. We all know about the iconic MLB strike in the mid-90s.
Mm-hmm.
The NFL had a couple of shortened seasons in the early 1980s, but the NBA had been unscathed up to this point. So in 1995, in that CBA, a 6-year CBA had been in place, and it included this clause that allowed owners to reopen the contract after 3 years if more than 51.8% of basketball-related income went to player salaries. That was the figure, 51.8. So the beating heart of this lockout now in 1998, to put it bluntly, was this coordinated push to curb players' earnings on behalf of the league's 29 owners, 12 of whom, I might note, were billionaires.
Wow, of course.
Right. And, by 1998, that player income share, that 51.8 figure that we're keeping an eye on, had actually jumped to 57%. So naturally, the clause was exercised and the standoff officially began. There were several other things on the table, like a hard salary cap, tamping down bird rights, restrictions on new money from the league's 4-year television deal with Turner and NBC, and other regulations that would test players for things like marijuana use and performance-enhancing drugs, things of the sort. And, owners also wanted to keep an eye on these large contracts, especially for young players. With the NBA booming in popularity thanks to Michael Jordan's Bulls and finally gaining some international recognition, the NBA had more money than ever. So players with potential franchise-altering ramifications were given these massive contracts. Most notably, Kevin Garnett, as a young Timberwolf, got a $126 million 6-year deal. And that was unprecedented for the time, especially for a player of Garnett's age.
Was that his first deal right out of high school?
Yes. Yeah, these guys were making big money, yeah. And of course, Garnett ends up being a Hall of Famer, but a lot of these guys coming out of high school who had oodles of natural talent were given these massive contracts. And at the end of the day, these guys are just kids. A lot of them are 18, 19 years old coming into a league. So, we jump ahead a little bit. They made some initial negotiations before sides broke off on June 22nd, and the lockout would officially start a little over a week after that. So in any lockout, teams were barred from making player transactions and holding workouts and meetings for the duration of the stoppage. Grant M. Hayden described the NBA's action as an offensive lockout in which an employer attempts to force its workers into a settlement that does not ultimately favor them. And interestingly, an early byproduct of the lockout was the exclusion of NBA players from the U.S. national team that played at the 1998 FIBA World Championship. So USA Basketball, the governing body for the sport in the United States, elected to send a team consisting of lower-level professional players and amateurs, which obviously a big step back as we're barely 6 years removed from the iconic Dream Team that ran through.
I'm willing to bet that did not end well, Josh.
It didn't. I'm sure you can guess how that ended. It's a big step down when you had all the talent in the league at their fingertips, and you had to opt for some amateurs and some college level guys. And I wanted to dive into the lockout because this does affect the Knicks in a significant manner. So without access to official facilities amid the lockout, Knicks players put together scrimmages and runs at West Hempstead's Island Garden Basketball Club and other gyms around the metropolitan area in New York. And it was there that hints of something special began to emerge. Now, we mentioned Starks previously. Heading into this 98-99 season, the Knicks were going to be without John Starks and without Charles Oakley, who were two of the most iconic players for these big-time Knicks runs throughout the early and mid-90s. So these scrimmages and makeshift practices kind of would have to do as the calendar flipped past fall and into the winter, and eventually the lockout starts swallowing games through January. And with teams withholding pay on guaranteed contracts, pressure is ratcheting up on the National Basketball Players Association, the NBPA. And this is interesting because it was none other than Patrick Ewing himself who was the president of the NBPA during the lockout. So the face of the Knicks was also the face of the players, as he'd go head-to-head with none other than David Stern at the negotiation table.
Which is a good... I mean, Ewing is real suited for this, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's such a professionalism to everything that Ewing does. So there's a lot on his plate, though. Like, how do these negotiations go?
He definitely had his work cut out for him. Ewing did a fantastic job. So Joshua Gordon, sports business professor at the University of Oregon, said David Stern was not an easy person to negotiate with. And Ewing did a good job of standing ground and sticking up to someone who was difficult to work with. Going with what you were saying with the way Ewing carried himself. Several players and union officials recently have sung the praises of Patrick Ewing's work as union president. Charlie Ward, New York Knicks at the time, said Ewing was very helpful in funneling information from the meetings to fellow players, even bringing some of them to the negotiations. Jeffrey Kessler, an attorney who worked both Sprewell's arbitration and the lockout negotiations, said that Patrick already had his long-term deal, but he still fought tooth and nail for the other players because he cared, and I had enormous respect for him. And then Patrick Ewing himself said in January of 1999, I led the best way I could. I was strong when I needed to be strong. So going along with what you were saying, yeah, great quote. So to kind of wrap up the lockout now, Stern threatens to cut off negotiations on January 7th and wipe out the entire season. He even mailed the latest proposal directly to the players in hopes to sow discord amongst them. But one day before that deadline, Patrick Ewing, Kessler, and NBPA Executive Director Billy Hunter got the players together at a Midtown law office bordering Central Park, and it was there that the union voted to accept the proposal. The players got their increases to the minimum salaries, the owners got their max player salary, a luxury tax, and the meeting exception. And the season would begin officially on February 5th to kick off this frantic 3-month, 50-game regular season in order to keep on track for the 1999-2000 season. And funny enough, you can go on YouTube and there's this Sprite commercial where they're advertising this hotline, 1-800-TALL-MEN, and it featured Grant Hill and Tim Duncan. And, you could call them and they could come do some menial house tasks for you, changing light bulbs, cleaning out the gutter, getting the cat down from the tree and stuff like that. And the commercial ends with Grant Hill saying, but hurry, because who knows when our season is going to start.
I love that. That's hilarious.
It's great. And I was watching, I'm like, what commercial is this for? And then all of a sudden at the end, I'm like, oh, it's a Sprite advertisement. That's classic. And Tim Duncan doesn't say a word the entire commercial. So it's good. I recommend checking it out. But, so, with negotiations officially complete, it's time to rock and roll. And now we can, transition our minds into basketball mode. Many questions were to be answered in real time. What's going to happen to the Knicks? Can Ewing lead a contending team one more time? Who's going to fill this power vacuum post Michael Jordan? And before I toss it back to Calvin, I just want to lay out the landscape of the favorites heading into this 1999 season. So there are 7 teams with 5-1 odds or better heading into the year, effectively creating this sort of inner circle, so to say. There are 2 more teams with better than 20-1 odds. The Sonics and the Hawks, they're sort of these fringe contenders, but there's really this core group of 7 teams that are tightly packed together. We got 3 teams in the East and 4 in the West. It was the Lakers who were technically the favorites, who were leading the way at plus 300. And remember, this is before they won their first title with Shaq and Kobe. Right on their heels are actually Calvin's Utah Jazz at plus 350, were the second leading team heading into the year. And then you had the Spurs and Rockets following after out west. And then in the East, the Pacers were the conference favorites, followed by the Miami Heat, and then our New York Knicks at 5-1.
5-1 feels really, really good. And there was good reason for that. The Knicks were actually coming off, a season where they had just barely finished above 500. So how does a team go from 500 to, being the 5th best odds to win the title? Well, on the eve of the official end to the lockout, teams are scrambling to get their rosters ready for a league without MJ. Because trades and signings had been frozen during the lockout. But we already alluded to it, that the Knicks roster looks quite a bit different on opening night than they did the previous season. They needed a missing piece to kind of make that final push to a very rapidly shrinking championship window. And that missing piece was a player whose personal lockout had been 68 games longer than anybody else. This dude, Latrell Sprewell.
Oh, man.
So, a little background on Spree. He had made his first All-Star appearance in just his second season with Golden State. And that's a pretty impressive feat, considering he was drafted just 25th overall in 1992 out of Alabama. Now, Spree is the type of brash, assertive, bombastic personality that was meant for the social media age. But this is some 12 years before Zuckerberg even has the idea of founding Facebook. So, pretty much from about the last 2 months of his rookie season on to his duration in the Bay Area, he was the main attraction on that Golden State team. And this is a team that had such NBA stalwarts like Chris Mullin and Tim Hardaway. But it was Sprewell's team. By 96-97 season, the 26-year-old Sprewell was 5th in the NBA in points per game. And just to put that in perspective, 3 of the players ahead of him were future Hall of Famers: Jordan, Malone, and Richmond. And he's right there, right next to these legends. But underneath the meteoric rise of the 6'5" ring from Milwaukee, there was a budding darkness. In 1993, Sprewell got into a fight with a teammate in practice. Apparently, it was a pretty big deal. In 1995, things escalated even more, as after another fight at practice, Sprewell came back to the practice facility with a 2x4, making threats to really do some damage, and even making threats of gun violence against NBA vet Jerome Kersley. Now, this is before the social media age, so it's difficult to really understand that these news stories, they were news in the local area, and they just kind of fizzled out. But not what happens next. So at last, the dangerous downward spiral hits rock bottom on December 1st, 1997, when Sprewell attacked his head coach with a chokehold. Then, just a few minutes later after that, after the fight was broken up, he comes back out and punches his coach right in the cheek.
Jeez.
And this just gets lit up across every news outlet across the country, to the point where within days, one of the NBA's brightest young stars found himself suspended for an entire season and then saw his contract voided by Golden State.
This isn't a coincidence that this is that we're talking about this the same season which Draymond Green and all his antics finally came to a head, right?
It is, and Draymond's suspension 10 games, Sprewell's suspension a season.
That's crazy.
And that's the difference between David Stern and Adam Silver, honestly. That's the difference between a business commissioner and a players commissioner. But it's 13 months later after that incident. Sprewell is reinstated to the NBA, but now he is a New York Knick. And the beloved former sidekick turned Game 7 scapegoat, John Starks, he's suiting up in Golden State. That was the trade, with a few other pieces. So now we're at the point of the podcast that we were talking about in the cold open. Now, by simple naming customs of NBA seasons, we call this the 98-99 NBA season, right? But in truth, not a single game occurred before the ball dropped on the 1999 New Year. The season kicked off on February 5th. There was a 12-game slate that night. And this is just a little side note. In the most typical 90s NBA fashion, only 6 of the 24 teams playing on the opening night even exceeded 100 points.
Classic.
But with the addition of the hot shooting but equally hot-hitted Sprewell, things were looking up. And just as Josh alluded to it, they had the 5th best championship odds. Shaq, Kobe, Lakers, the 2-time runner-up Utah Jazz, Reggie Miller's Pacers and the San Antonio Spurs have better odds. And this was despite the fact, by the way, that the Knicks had one of the smallest lineups in the NBA at the time. We mentioned Charles Oakley is gone. He was traded for a young, promising, but beanstalk of a human being named Marcus Camby.
Accurate description.
In fact, Van Gundy would say, we are the smallest team in the NBA. Last year, we did that and still held our own in defensive rebounding. We have to be a blockout team. We have to make contact. We have to gang rebound with all 5 guys. So, despite the size, honestly, the biggest concern wasn't size, it was availability. Okay, typical NBA season, 82 games over about 170, 175 days. After returning from the lockout, the Knicks faced that 50-game schedule in just under 90 days. This included some ridiculous stretches, including 9 games in 12 days in one stretch in March. We're not talking about back-to-backs here. We're talking about triple back-to-backs.
Jeez, yeah.
And this is with Ewing, who's already over the hill. He's coming off a major wrist injury. And even younger players on this roster, like Larry Johnson and Kurt Thomas, have a long documented history of injury issues. One had to wonder if the Knicks, and really any NBA team, would be fielding a skeleton crew by the time the playoffs rolled around just 3 months away. Well, as would happen, Thomas and Johnson actually do manage to play a full regular season, avoiding the injury bug. Ewing was not so lucky. All right? He posted minutes in 38 of the team's 50 regular season games, but fails to average at least 20 points per game for the first time in his career. So when it's all added up, the new look and high hope Knicks were honestly, it just was not peaches and cream. In fact, they spent most of the season hovering just above that Mason-Dixon line of 500 basketball. And every time things looked good, such as winning 8 of 9 to close out February, there was always another shoe to drop, such as losing 4 games in a single week in March. But here's the interesting thing, Josh, and I find this very interesting. The strange thing is, it was in the games that Ewing missed that the team really started to show something. All right, we're talking about making lemonade out of lemons. Sports Illustrated writer Marty Burns explained, just when the Sprewell experiment seemed a failure, it got new life. With Patrick Ewing's playing time limited by his chronically sore right Achilles tendon, and athletic Marcus Camby seeing more minutes in Ewing's stead, Sprewell suddenly found himself with more opportunities to shine. Better spacing on the floor, and teammates who enhanced his open court game. He found creases in the defense. He hit the open man. He became a complement to Allen Houston, giving the Knicks a 2-pronged outside-in attack as opposed to the previous inside-out attack anchored by Ewing. I'm going to say it, Josh. I think this is maybe the very, very early inklings we get of what we now call small ball.
Definitely, yeah. You can definitely see the seeds here where the Knicks kind of experiment with these tropes and philosophies and strategies that are rampant today, all the way back in 1999, and they're getting some results.
They're getting some results, but maybe not quite the results they want. And we're going into an April 19th game at Philadelphia. The Knicks only managed to score 67 points.
It's
their 5th straight loss, and suddenly they're 21-21. That's tied record with the Charlotte Hornets for the last spot in the playoffs. But as always had during that shooting season, fortunes turned 180 degrees again, and the Knicks actually go on to win 6 of their last 8 games, including 2 victories over Charlotte. And these 2 W's over the Hornets proved to be the difference maker. The Knicks ended the season with 27 wins. Charlotte finishes with 26. The Knicks are playoff bound, but they face the toughest test imaginable. 8 seeds don't beat 1 seeds. In fact, at this point in NBA history, it had only happened once. You should check our episode on the 1994 Denver Nuggets for that story. But they're going up against the one-seeded Miami Heat, who looked every bit like a championship-caliber team led by Alonzo Mourning, and under president and coach and former Van Gundy boss, Pat Riley. It definitely seems at this point that the clock was indeed about to strike midnight on the Knicks' Cinderella story. But the Knicks, they had other plans.
Other plans they had, man, what a regular season. Great. Love the way you outlined that to kind of illustrate not only how strenuous that season was for the Knicks, but how it was for the league as a whole with the way the schedule was structured. It was a hectic and frantic 3 months. And I mean that in every sense of the word. So after, putting in this considerable effort, the Knicks, they earned themselves a rematch against the Heat. Who, like Calvin had mentioned, who had controversially resigned via fax back in the summer of 1995. And these two teams have a little bit of history. The tension escalates in 1997 with a bench clearing incident in the playoffs, which involved PJ Brown suplexing Charlie Ward. Another bench clearing event occurred in the 1998 playoffs when Alonzo Mourning and Larry Johnson exchanged punches. You can probably find a pretty iconic photo of Jeff Van Gundy clinging to the leg of a player. Awesome photo, honestly.
Oh, what is Van Gundy? 5'8", 5'9", just clinging on for dear life with these ankle.
These specimen players, yeah. One day when I got my man cave, that'd be a fun picture to have, right? To capture the era. But the thing is, both these playoff series went the distance, and this 1999 edition of the matchup lived up to expectations. So in his 4 seasons with the Knicks, Riley transitioned from the flashy style of the Showtime Lakers in the 80s to a more direct physical approach that dictated the 90s, known as bully ball. And despite the team consistently achieving over 50 wins each season under his coaching, this departure was far from amicable. So the tensions, again, are going to escalate even more since Miami is extremely competitive and they mirror the Knicks' style, but have been surpassing them in recent years in performance. Charlie Ward recalls, who played under Pat Riley for a season, "We were running the same plays because we were built the same. We were drinking out of the same water. That's one of the reasons why during that series, a team could be up by 20 points and the next moment the other team would be leading." So the 1999 first-round playoff series mirrored the regular season clashes in both intensity and unpredictability. The Knicks secure a 20-point victory on the road in Game 1, fueled by 22 points each from Allen Houston and Latrell Sprewell. But then they stumble in Game 2, losing by 10 with just a 39% field goal percentage, as Alonzo Mourning dominates with 26 points, 8 rebounds, 3 steals, and 4 blocks, really filling up the box score. So going back to the Garden, the Knicks triumph in Game 3 with flawless shot distribution, disrupting Dan Marley and Jamal Mashburn while turning Tim Hardaway's offense into a nightmare. And despite the regular season unpredictability, the Knicks still consistently excelled at Madison Square Garden, where they were 19-6. Although Mourning was contained in Game 4, there was a rally from bench players like Weatherspoon, Vashon Leonard, Terry Porter, a former Trailblazer, to help level the series at 2 games apiece. Remember, this is a best of 5 in 1999. So in a potential clincher at home, no Knicks scored more than 12 points, squandering a big opportunity as the series went back to Miami for the decisive game.
It's heartbreaking if you're a Knicks fan. You probably think it's all over at this point.
Definitely, especially it was a pretty rough Game 4, and you go back and watch Game 5. It's a pretty iconic game for the ending that I'll outline here in a second. Go on YouTube, look it up. They have the full fourth quarter there, full second half actually, and the gameplay appears almost unrecognizable. Limbs collide, bodies converge, the court shrinks. There is no spacing whatsoever, and the crowd roars with each inside feed to Ewing or Mourning, while shooters sort of just linger in the background. The two teams collectively make only 7 3-pointers in the game.
That's about 10 minutes of play in today's NBA game.
Right, I was going to say, if you're not at 7 by the end of towards the end of the first quarter, then something's wrong. But this game did not lack in drama nor fireworks. Fast forwarding to the end of the game, a nice spin move toward the baseline by LJ on Jamal Mashburn gave the Knicks a sliver of a 74-73 lead late with about 2 minutes remaining. Alonzo answered with a hook shot that gave the game its 4th lead change in the last 2 minutes. And then Terry Porter, again, the former Blazer and former All-Star, now in the twilight of his career, is fouled on a rebound and makes 2 more free throws for the Heat to give them a 3-point lead. 77-74, 1 minute remaining. New York timeout is called, and the Miami faithful chant, "Whoop, there it is," to just deafening. And it's actually pretty hype. It's a really cool atmosphere to go back and watch. And I mean, I know if I was watching that game live, it would feel like, oh, they're gonna close this out. But coming out of the timeout, Sprewell misfires on a 7-footer, but Patrick Ewing is there to clean up the mess, foul on the putback, and he nails 2 big-time free throws to pull the Knicks back within a point. And it was there where New York's defense stiffens up. Sprewell makes a fantastic swipe at the ball as Tim Hardaway looks to get into his sequencing. Larry Johnson ends up with the loose ball, and just like that, the Knicks have a chance to steal the game and the series. A final play is drawn up, with Sprewell banging around a Ewing screen and searching for space. It was a disheveled play, to say the least. No one got a shot up, and Terry Porter knocks the ball away from Sprewell and out of bounds with 4.5 seconds remaining. On the second inbound, it's Allen Houston who curls around the action, ducks 2 defenders, and lurches forward a shot from the right elbow that hits right iron, then glass, and then net. With the game, the series, going to New York.
Themselves 2 chances to tie or win the ball game. 4 seconds. Van Gundy calls a play, a triangle. That usually means something for Ewing. Allen Houston. Houston ducks under. Got it! With 8 tenths left.
What a way to end it. That's got to be one of the most underrated NBA moments of the last few decades. What an ending.
And, even though it's not, it's a shot that wins the series. I mean, it's not just a game winner, it's a series winner, and you don't see those that often. So for the Knicks, it's on to Atlanta, and this is a Hawks team that's in the midst of one of their most competitive eras in franchise history. They have the services, we kind of mentioned him earlier with the 1994 Nuggets. Dikembe Mutombo, again, who is a Hawk now, finishes second for Defensive Player of the Year voting that year, while Steve Smith was an all-star the previous season. The Hawks went 31-19 in the lockout shortened year, and were coming off of 50-plus win seasons in 1997 and 1998, and they're led by legendary coach Lenny Wilkins, who possibly deserves an episode of his own. And, well, it's anticlimactic. The series ends in a New York sweep of all Hawks to attempt at least 10 shots in the 4-game series. Calvin, this is crazy. I could not believe this when I looked this up. No Hawk shot more than 50% from the field. Again, of all Hawks that shot at least 10 shots in the 4-game series. Scratch that. Not even 40% from the field for any Atlanta Hawk.
Ooh, this is where you play that GIF. The ooh.
Yep.
GIF.
Oh, yeah. I know what you're talking about. Like, this is all-time futility. Steve Smith, he leads the way for the Hawks with 16 points a game, which seems respectable, but he did it on 27% shooting. Dikembe averaged a solid 10 points and 14 rebounds with 2 blocks, but he shoots 39%. And as we know, for a big man of the era, 39% is not going to cut it. And, credit where credit's due. The series really belonged to Spree. He saw his minutes shoot up to 34 per game, and he averages a really efficient 22 points per game for the Knicks. So now it's on to Indiana, another familiar foe. And like the Heat, Knicks fans had a lived-in disdain for the Pacers, but really, it was mostly directed at Reggie Miller. So in a very brief time, Reggie Miller fashioned this reputation for tearing down the Madison Square Garden. We have the iconic heat check in front of Spike Lee in the 1994 playoffs, the iconic 8 points in 9 seconds that happened against the Knicks the following postseason, and for good measure, he hit a game-tying 3 that more or less swung the 1998 second-round series just a year before. So Mike Breen, we all know Mike Breen, back when he was doing Knicks games, he says, in my era of broadcasting Knicks games, he was the number 1 villain. There was a respect factor there, but he tortured them. He thrived. He egged it on. That's what the Knicks fans always wanted, to shut him up.
I think every NBA fan has that one player who just cooks your team every time, every season. Knicks fans, I feel your pain. I feel that.
So this series, the Knicks pull out this game one upset. That's got to feel great. 93-90. The game is physical. It's gritty. It's a harbinger of the series to come. Afterwards, Jeff Van Gundy and Indiana coach Larry Bird are both warned by Dick Bavetta that the series is going to be called a little bit tighter. But it would also cost the Knicks Patrick Ewing. In Game 2, he succumbs to that Achilles injury that Calvin was alluding to and would miss the rest of the postseason, a game that was also a Knicks loss. And it's a devastating moment. One of the franchise's greatest players had fought through the lockout off the court and then on the court through body aches and waning skills, only to be forced to watch his last best chance at a ring from the bench. And Ewing says, it's frustrating to work so hard and be so close to something I've dreamed about for so many years.
That's heartbreaking. And Ewing's such a professional, such a man, just such impeccable character. You hate to see something like that.
You really do. You really do. And this is another thing Calvin mentioned. The Knicks were already a small team, and they're suddenly left a lot smaller and a lot younger. Even though Ewing wasn't putting up the 20 to 25 points per game that he was before, he was still a force. He was still a very good basketball player. Let's not get it twisted here. So suddenly, Larry Johnson was the resident veteran who himself had been dealing with some chronic back issues that would eventually force him out of the league 2 years later. But there was still a little bit of magic left for the Knicks. In Game 3, with Ewing wearing all black on the bench, the Knicks were promptly dominated at center by 7'4" Rick Smits, who went for 25 points on 13 shots.
Good old Rick Smits.
Good old Rick Smits. Very, very good player. Very, very big. 7'4". And it looks like the Pacers are going to snap the necks of the Knicks and take this pivotal Game 3 on the road. Knicks down 91-88 with 12 seconds on the clock. Knicks call timeout to advance the ball. And as shooters and screeners crowd together, Charlie Ward's hurried pass was tipped and fell into the hands of Larry Johnson, who took a jab step toward isolated Antonio Davis, drew a little bit of contact, and put up a three. That shot dropped and won. 4-point play for the Knicks as they steal Game 3 in one of the more iconic moments in NBA history.
Johnson is fouled and hit! The game is a long way from being over. Got it! Larry Bird and the Indiana Pacers, who has lost in this building. Bird has too many times.
Fantastic moment. And fun fact about me, I must have been 6 years old. I watched that moment live, Josh.
No way.
We had that on my
sweet.
TV.
That is cool. I did not know. That's one of my favorite moments, because you go back and you watch, and there are quotes from after the game where they're like, I have never heard Madison Square Garden as loud then as it's ever been. So that's a cool little moment. And so the Knicks dropped the next game, Game 4, but they steal Game 5 in Indiana behind a 29-point blowout from Sprewell. 29 points from Sprewell and 21 more from Marcus Camby, who is having a breakout series in his own right. He's for the Eastern Conference Finals. Camby averages 14 points, 11 rebounds, 2 steals, and 3 blocks, filling up the box score for the young athletic player, a player who would eventually be the Defensive Player of the Year in the mid to late 2000s. And this most volatile ride could continue to the finals with one more win back in the concrete jungle. Mike Breen says Game 6 might have been Allen Houston's finest moment. He did whatever he wanted that night. And the old expression was true. He would not let the Knicks lose in a zone that I had never seen from him. Well, what did that game look like? Allen Houston puts on a masterclass against the Indiana defense, going 8 for 9 shooting in the second half alone, en route to 32 points as Reggie Miller shot just 3 for 18, and Indiana commits 26 turnovers, proving to just be outmatched by the Knicks, who were riding this emotional high. And this is just another Pyrrhic victory, unfortunately, as Larry Johnson sprains his right knee in the first half, an injury that would go on to nag him through the remainder of the postseason, in addition to the Knicks already missing Ewing. But nevertheless, the buzzer sounds after 4 quarters, vindicating one of the oddest, unexpected, and most resilient conference champions in league history. And Latrell Sprewell said during a 2017 team reunion, "We just wanted Patrick to get a ring, but we all wanted a ring. I didn't have a ring. we wanted to do it for New York as well. We had so much pride in being Knicks players.
Gotta love that kind of quote. And Ewing remains, one of those great players who never got a ring. Because you got Stockton and Malone, you got Allen Iverson. Ewing is in a pretty sad club, having never gotten over the hump. But he got closer than a lot of people realize during these finals. A lot of people think this was a one-sided NBA Finals. It was not. But before we jump into that, let's talk about the team coming out of the West, Josh. So, a quarter of the way through San Antonio's season, the panic button was almost ready to be hit. Despite boasting a roster that was headlined by two of those major can't-miss surefire number one draft picks, David Robinson and Tim Duncan, and now they have Wembanyama, go figure that. But with Duncan and Robinson, San Antonio actually bumbled out of the gate to a 6-8 record to begin the season. Things were so bad that rumors started circulating that Greg Popovich was in over his head as coach, and that he was on not just the hot seat, we're talking the flaming hot magma seat. The rumored replacement? A ex-player who at the time was working for San Antonio's TV broadcast team, named Doc Rivers. In fact, things were getting so bad, the rumor was that if the Spurs lost in a game at Houston on March 2nd to fall to 6-9, Coach Pop would have to find his own way home. Well, Josh, the Spurs won that game, and then won again, and again, and again. That victory in Houston kicked off a 9-game win streak, and San Antonio's record from that day on was 31-5.
Jeez.
Talk about flipping on the light. Now, unlike the one seed in the East, the one-seeded San Antonio Spurs easily dispatched the 8-seeded competition. A Timberwolves team that, in again those best-of-5 series, San Antonio wins 3-1. From there, they swept the Lakers, they swept the Blazers, and they enter the 99 NBA Finals, having only lost one playoff game. And this is interesting, with a different player having led the team in scoring in each playoff series. Duncan had been masterful against the Lakers. Avery Johnson had his moment in the sun against Minnesota. And the Admiral had led the way against Portland. So, by all accounts, the Knicks looked dreadfully outmatched. But they pretty much had looked outmatched in 3 straight playoff series. And the results there? 3 straight wins. This was going to be a series that New York truly believed they could win. The Spurs may have had the superior firepower. The Knicks had an almost mystical momentum. The question was, would that be enough for David to slay Goliath? Well, no. Spoiler alert. Although the Knicks had adjusted well to playing without Ewing through a good chunk of the regular season and the playoffs, the finals were a different animal, especially against a low-post-centric team like the Twin Towers.
I was going to say the size just has to be overwhelming at that point.
It is, and in Game 1, the big fundamental had a big fun feast. Serving up journeyman center Chris Dudley with 33 points on 16 rebounds on 62% shooting. So Dudley, nicknamed Dr. Crash, by the way, great nickname.
Nice.
He had been forced into a starting role despite having spent by far the majority of his 13-year NBA career as a backup. And in this Game 1, in 23 minutes and 37 seconds on the floor, he had a defensive rating of 98, solid, and an offensive rating of 27.
Oh my goodness.
I wish that was a typo, Josh. I really do.
Man.
It was not. But, this wasn't all Dr. Crash to blame, though. Sprewell shot just 9 of 24. and Allen Houston connected on just 7 of 17. And the Knicks had a team offensive rating of just 86. They only had 12 assists on their 31 made field goals. Compare that to San Antonio, had 25 assists on 32 made shots. The ultimate team. And that second quarter of game 1, by the way, was especially painful for Van Gundy's squad. They only managed 10 points in that period. And that was ultimately the difference as they lose game 1 by a score of 89-77. All right, on to game 2. We see the teams back in the Alamo Dome of San Antonio. And, well, just keeping to the script, it was another vomit-worthy shooting effort from the Knicks. And an absolute clinic from Timmy Duncan. This time he had 25 and 15 on 53% shooting. Sprewell, to his credit, had something of a bounce-back game. He had 26 points, but he did need a less than efficient 22 field goal attempts to make it happen. Sprewell did most of his damage from the foul line, where he was 10 for 10, by the way. So the Knicks managed to keep the Spurs in sight through the first half of Game 2. They hit the locker room down just 5. And honestly, Josh, this was a close game. A 17-foot jumper from Allen Houston with 2:41 left in the third quarter even had the lead down to 3. But that was as close as it would get, and San Antonio pulls away late for the 80-67 victory. Now, down 2, this is when the series goes back to Manhattan. And keep in mind, this is in the time where the NBA Finals were with the 2-3-2 format.
Mm-hmm.
So that's 2 games in San Antonio, 3 games in New York, followed by 2 games in San Antonio. So the Knicks know that they can at least guarantee a Game 7 if they take care of business at home. So let's talk about Game 3. And let's begin it right here, because earlier in the season, Knicks superfan Spike Lee, who we mentioned briefly, had quite famously swapped his Patrick Ewing number 33 jersey for a number 8 jersey with the name Sprewell on the back. But over the next 38 minutes, I bet you Lee probably strongly considered yet another swap, this time for number 20 with the name Houston. The 6-year pro out of Tennessee, to this point, had not yet made an All-Star game. But, Josh, his appearance in the game in each of the next 2 seasons could perhaps be traced back to this June 21st evening. We already talked about the big Game 6 against Indiana. I think this game was bigger. Allen explodes out of the tunnel to claim 8 of the Knicks' first 10 points, part of a 13-point first quarter. Also, there was 8 from his running mate Sprewell, and that's enough to give the Knicks an 11-point lead after 1. The hurt start was enough to withstand multiple mini runs from San Antonio in Q2 and into the locker room with a 3-point lead. This is the first time in the series they lead at halftime. Once again, out of the tunnels, and with the backing of 19,763 rabid Knick fans, it was the Allen Houston show in Q3. Has he personally outscored San Antonio 7-1 over the first 3 minutes of the second half?
Dang.
So Houston finishes with 34, and Sprewell added 25, all coming against the NBA's top defense. And this is handing Popovich's squad just their second L of the postseason, and just their 7th setback since the time that Popovich's job was on the line just a few months earlier. This was, no way to get around it, a big win in NYC. Chris Broussard, who was working for the New York Times at this point in history, would write, "The rowdiness of the fans and the breadth of the situation were not supposed to rattle the reserved and typically unflappable San Antonio Spurs. Their experience and calm was supposed to eliminate the setting and scenario and it has an issue in Game 3 of the finals. But the Spurs melted beneath the heat of Madison Square Garden stage. The Spurs lost to the Knicks by 89-81.
Wow.
So suddenly it seems like we have a series, right? The 8-seeded Knicks, who had already done the unthinkable 3 times, had proved that the number 1-seeded Spurs were not invincible. And now they had guaranteed 2 more games at home before heading back to the Lone Star State. But then again, maybe they should cancel that trip. Because posting yet another MVP caliber performance in Game 4, Tim Duncan had 28 and 18. His victim this time was the 23-year-old Marcus Camby, who Josh alluded to is still years away from earning his status as an elite shot blocker. He had been inserted into the starting lineup in place of just the incredibly ineffective Dudley.
Dudley, Mr. Crash.
And it was, but to Camby's effort, it was a truly valiant effort from the youngster. He had 20 and 13, but that was not enough to overcome the dominant and composed play of San Antonio, who stretched a 4-point halftime lead out to 13 as the Knicks did not score in the second half until the 8-minute mark of Q3. So, with as much determination and pluck as you would expect to see from an 8 seed in the finals, New York actually manages to claw back and make this a 1-point game with just 5 minutes to play. But then the Twin Towers do Twin Tower things. And on the back of the old vet from Navy and the young phenom from Wake Forest, San Antonio had regained a 10-point lead as the clock ticked below a minute. They returned to their New York City hotel rooms with a 96-89 win. Brings us to Game 5. And, we've talked about it on this podcast. They say the brightest stars shine in closeout games. With a chance to close things out in Game 5. It was an unusually cool June day in NYC. But Duncan would sizzle red hot. 31 points to go along with 9 rebounds. But as is so often the case here, Josh, it was an unexpected hero who would ultimately win the day. So we're jumping into a game here that is underrated as an all-time classic. We're talking about a game where the desperate fans at Madison Square Garden saw 12 ties, and 12 lead changes. This is all leading up to a couple of made free throws from Sprewell to put the Knicks up 77-75 with 3 minutes, 12 seconds to play. On the other end, Duncan misses one of his 2 free throws on the following possession. And the Knicks are holding on to this do-or-die 1-point lead. They have a chance to extend it, maybe even make it a 2-possession game. The Knicks had not 1, not 2, but 3 opportunities to extend this lead.
Ugh.
A missed layup, a missed 3-pointer, and a shot clock violation. Josh, that's what we call brutality.
Mm-hmm.
But a gift from on high was still available to the Knicks as David Robinson actually misses a layup of his own on the other side. The Knicks' response? A Larry Johnson missed desperation 3-pointer with 2 seconds on the shot clock. San Antonio hadn't become the league's best defensive team by chance, after all. And the ensuing go-ahead basket by San Antonio wasn't delivered by either of San Antonio's 2 future Hall of Famers. Instead, the dagger to the heart of NYC faithful was in the form of an 18-foot baseline jumper from Avery Johnson. After exchanging a couple additional misses, the Knicks did have one final shot, one final prayer. They were inbounding from just inside midcourt with 2.2 seconds on the clock, but the pass to Sprewell was off target. And by the time he had collected the ball, there was no time for a shot. Spurs win Game 5. David Robinson, with all of his class, simply put 2 fists up in the air, and San Antonio had claimed their first of what would ultimately be many championships and the clock had struck midnight on the 8th seed Cinderella New York Knicks.
Jeez. Man, that is a little bit of a deceiving 5-game series, even though it felt like it was never out of control for the Spurs. I mean, going through that, the Knicks hung in there.
Yeah, I mean, it could have pivoted so many times. It could have pivoted in the other direction.
Mm-hmm.
You know, credit to that San Antonio team, one of just the most dominant defensive teams and best passing teams we've seen.
Right.
But the Knicks had their chances. You know,
they definitely did.
That's what you expect from an 8 seed that makes it all the way to the finals. They're not going to bow down about a fight. And this season was one to remember for the Knicks. The next season, they would be dispatched in the Eastern Conference Finals to Indiana, who would go on to lose to the Lakers.
Mm-hmm.
From there, they would not make it past the second round to date.
Jeez.
So this is 1998-99. And again in 99-2000, conference finals. Since that time, they have never made it past the second round.
Futility. Wow. You know, and I'm glad we covered this team because it was very. I mean, I was aware of this team. I was aware of this run, especially it was mentioned several times during the Miami Heat's run last year to the finals as an 8 seed, and I was always aware that this was a very beloved team. Even though the 1995 team also made the finals, there was something very unique, not only about the season but about this specific roster making a run to the finals. And it's very aware that this is one of, if not the most beloved Knicks roster ever. I mean, I'm sure you can certainly make a case for some of those early 1970s teams with Willis Reed and Walt Frazier, but something about the way that this specific team really embodied what New Yorkers would think in their mind to be New York basketball. That's resilience, that's grittiness, that's determination. I mean, it's a lot of cliches. I know it's cliches, but how can you not go through all of this and not come to that same conclusion? And I think it's cool that we're talking about this in a year, or at least in a couple season stretch, the last couple of years where the Knicks are relevant again. It has been a very long 25 years for what is one of the most iconic brands in the sport. And to kind of finally see the fan base rally around this team again. Right now we have a team with Jalen Brunson, with Julius Randle, with OG Anunoby, with Mitchell Robinson, some other really good players. To see them rally around this roster again, it shows how cool it is when Madison Square Garden is popping. And I want to say, I mean, makes you really ask that what if question that we dig into a lot here on the podcast. What if Patrick Ewing hadn't gotten hurt, or what if they had pulled out the finals regardless? What are the historical implications of that? And makes you wonder. Maybe the Spurs clearly were the better team, like you said. This is really an all-time NBA champion that doesn't get talked about enough because of the lockout shortened season. It was a really weird year, but I mean, you can make a case that the Knicks certainly looked better in spurts without Ewing on the floor because Sprewell got more opportunity, as did Marcus Camby. But at the same time, they really could have used Ewing's size in the NBA Finals, and maybe that could have been the difference to make it more of a 50-50 coin flip.
Yeah, no doubt. And that's why we love the game, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's why we watch the game, because anything can happen, and the smallest little, detail can change the impact of NBA history wherever we take the NBA time machine. This has been Once Upon a Dribble. Once again, however you've been listening, we appreciate you, and if you'd be so kind to give us a like, a subscription, a comment, share the podcast with your friends. That helps us grow. We have a lot of good content planned for you, and we're just happy to be here and happy to share this NBA time machine experience with you. Josh, anything to say before we sign off?
Yeah, just give us a listen, share us around. We're keeping a close eye on the NBA season as this unfolds, and we'll of course be looking to pump some more stuff out here over the coming weeks. We have lots of ideas and lots of stuff that we want to share with y'all. So we appreciate it. We just actually, I want to mention this quick. We had our Spotify Wrapped for 2023 pop up on my email inbox just a few weeks ago, and it was honestly really cool to see. I know we're still small, but it means a lot to see how far things have come. And I know Calvin and I have genuine passion for it. So we're excited. This is the first episode of 2024, and we couldn't be more excited and anxious to roll out what we have planned for this year.
For Josh Medeiros, I'm Calvin Johnson. This has been Once Upon a Dribble.